No, so it's basically just the identity parameters. It's probably this huge thing with our lawyers, like all your titles and like
Guys, ladies and gentlemen, friends and enemies, I don't know what else to say. But I would like to introduce Kitty from Rarimo to you to go over, not necessarily a workshop, more about the theoretical part, but Kitty will tell you a bit more about it.
Hi guys, I'm Kitty from Rarimo. And Rarimo is a ZK protocol making identities and social graphs private. So to give you a sense of the kind of use cases that this has unlocked, about 6 months ago we released a surveillance-free voting solution called Freedom Tool. And it was immediately picked up by dissidents in Russia who used Putin. It was then used by dissidents in Iran, and most recently we just had our first use case with elected officials in Georgia, where opposition MPs used it to operate tamper-proof polling. So I'm going to talk about these use cases, but then I'm also going to explain how in the process of building these tools, where privacy couldn't just be like an abstract thing we were aiming to, but had to actually withstand attacks from the Kremlin and whatnot, we discovered a lot of issues with the typical frameworks, or the typical model that identity frameworks in Web3 tend to use. So I'm going to describe those problems and also how we circumvented that and built a system that was much more robust. So as I mentioned, Freedom Tool is a surveillance-free voting solution, and it solved a long-term challenge in digital democracy, which is how do you run the identity checks necessary to ensure that people are eligible to vote without simultaneously making them vulnerable to tracing. And we did this through the magic of passport ZKPs. So if anyone is new to ZK, it's a type of cryptography that lets one party prove to another that certain facts are true without revealing any additional information. So for voting, we let people prove their nationality, their age, and the fact that they're unique. And the solution is super easy to use. Like you take your phone and you just scan the NFC chip in your passport, and Freedom Tool will verify the data, produce a ZKP, and give you an anonymous voting pass. And then all the votes themselves are published onto the blockchain where they're tamper-proof. And it's like, I really can't emphasize how easy and quick it is. Like a lot of our users were not Web3 native. They were like, just normal people. Everything runs on the mobile phone. No data ever leaves, never passes through a centralized server. And the entire solution is open source, so anyone can use it. And as I mentioned, our first use case was in Russia. So the tool was picked up by this guy called Mark Fagan, who's the former Pussy Riot lawyer. And he used it to launch an app called Russia 2024. And the first vote that they held on the app was a referendum challenging Putin's inauguration. So citizens were invited to vote on whether or not they thought the election process was legitimate. And obviously, like the first kind of thing that this app did is it gave dissidents an outlet to express their dissent, which is very, very difficult to do in Russia at the moment. But more than that, it also created a feedback loop between between opposition in general and the people they were seeking to represent. So in a regime like Russia, it's so difficult for organizers and opposition leaders to get a sense of what the people that they want to support are actually thinking and feeling, and being able to conduct elections and votes like within that community was one of the goals of Russia 2024. And it had over 40,000 votes and over 25,000 downloads in the first 24 hours of release, which broke records for Web3. But of course, like the big kind of obstacle with any tech like this is trust. People can face up to 7 years prison for protest. So there's like a huge hesitancy to take these kind of risks. There we go. But the user numbers actually surpassed our expectations, and we expect that as people see that the users remain like unpersecuted, that more and more people will participate in future elections. And the app was attacked by the Kremlin several times. So I think one of the like strangest and most like interesting forms of attack that the Kremlin did is it turns out they have like a kind of state-sponsored cabal of app reviewers who just give apps like really bad rankings that they don't want to be like found easily on the app store. So they did this to Freedom Tool, but we were getting messages like from the state-sponsored reviewers being like, I was forced to review this badly, please don't remove it, we really need surveillance-free voting in Russia. So yeah, that's the Russian use case. The use case in Iran was very similar. It was picked up by NGOs in Iran, one of which was Amin Soleimani's Iran Unchained, and used there to give citizens a chance to register no faith in the presidential election, so like a vote of no confidence. And the use case in Georgia was slightly different. So opposition MPs used it to launch tamper-proof polling, but they also used the underlying identity infrastructure to try combat low voter turnout. So they set up a point system where citizens were given rewards for voting, for polling, for taking part in other civic activities like reporting voter fraud. And they received these points regardless of political allegiance. So it was really like an attempt to sort of like engage like younger demographics who were more like tech savvy. And they also pledged that if elected, they would use the tool to conduct experiments in liquid democracy, which is where you vote not just like on a presidential election, but routinely on lots of legislation. And digital voting makes this possible in a way that physical voting doesn't, because physical voting is just so expensive. You can't hold like frequent elections. And they also pledged to use the tech to digitize a bunch of different state services and also distribute universal basic income. So that's a kind of overview of the use cases. But as I mentioned, we discovered all these kind of privacy vulnerabilities in pre-existing identity systems. So to sort of like explain that, the biggest challenge that you have with any identity protocol is uniqueness. So like voting is like a pretty intuitive like example of why uniqueness is important to an identity framework. Like you don't want people hijacking the system and voting again and again and again. But you also only need to look at like airdrops and bot farming to like get a sense of how widespread the need for uniqueness is. But it's very difficult. It's like, okay, how do you make sure that someone like isn't in the system, that they're unique and they aren't anyone else in the system without compromising any personal data? And what most frameworks have found themselves forced to do is rely on third-party attesters. So like say, for example, you were using your fingerprint to like prove your identity or uniqueness. In the pre-existing model, what would happen is a nullifier of your fingerprint would be checked against all the other nullifiers in the system. And then you would ask, like you would basically request the attester to issue you with like a proof of uniqueness. This would happen and you would go off and you would use it for like whatever use case you wanted to. And that model is, creates all sort of potential privacy vulnerabilities. So if somebody gets a hold of the third-party attester, they can figure out like exactly what you're generating your proof of uniqueness for, which if you are operating in a high-risk environment, say like Russia, and you're doing votes that could alone be perceived as an active protest, that is a risk that we weren't willing to take. And just being able to see how people are acting, even if you can't see like how they're voting, could be risky. But even like outside of use cases like voting, you can imagine why you wouldn't want an outside party to be able to figure out what your behavior you're engaging in anyway. And third-party attesters bring all sorts of other additional risks, like they're very vulnerable to regulatory interference, they can be shut down, fined, there can be demand for data, but also I think like most alarmingly, they perpetuate this like cycle of dependency on centralized sources. So like ideally, if we're building like a new privacy-first world and a world where people really own their identities and have agency, you don't want them to have to request to an external party to prove their own identities. Like you want them to be able to just self-issue and be like, boom, I prove I'm unique. This is in like my own hands and my own capacity. So that is the system that we built. And we've launched what we call the ZK Identity Registry, which is like a completely new paradigm for anonymous identity, and it got rid of third-party attesters. So you don't have any of the vulnerabilities that I was talking about beforehand. And how it works is like whatever identity you're using, so we use passports, I used fingerprints as an example earlier, but we use passports. You would create a nullifier of that passport, of that identifier, and the nullifier is published on chain, and then you yourself can just self-issue proofs of inclusion in that registry. So there isn't this like middleman doing any of it. And that eliminates this threat that someone can figure out like precisely what you're using your identity for. So even in like a worst case scenario, if like a government seized your passport or got a hold of your private keys, all they would be able to figure out is that you're registered inside the registry. They wouldn't be able to tell if it was for voting or for like collecting meme coins or like whatever you're doing with it. And we called this the privacy as network effect, because the more people who join the network, the more difficult it is to make logical deductions about how people are behaving. So more users, more apps, like stronger privacy guarantees. But I think as well, like what's equally important about this model is that as well as strengthening the privacy guarantees, you return power to the users. So it's completely permissionless, it's self-issued. Everything I was saying earlier about like you don't want reliance on this outside party is sort of like solved. And I think it's super, super important that we use this framework, because the identity space is quite nascent, and if we continue to use frameworks that embed third-party attesters, we're going to see all sorts of problems arise as the ecosystem develops that aren't even like fully visible now. And I think it's quite naive to put trust in any kind of, you know, third-party model that has this capacity to control like when and how you issue your identity. And the exciting thing about Rarimo's identity registry is that passports, EKPs, and all the stuff that we use for voting is only one branch of it. So we have all sorts of different sub-registries, and the one that the community is sort of focused on at the moment and is really building out is the ZK reputation sub-registry. So this is where you can like bring your social graph and your historical interactions into a private but verifiable state. And this is really significant for the privacy space, because one of the reasons privacy has struggled to scale traditionally is that it comes at the cost of social capital. Like it's very, very difficult to like remain private, but be like, but hey, also I have all these friends in all these places and I've like done all these things. And this technology or this infrastructure allows people to do that. So we're really excited about the kind of like social apps that we'll see blossom on top of this that really like make use of that. So if you are interested in getting started like with this ecosystem and issuing your own identities, you can download this app, which is Rarimo. So this is for passports, and it lets you create like a kind of anonymous incognito profile that's on your phone. So it's like in a private wallet, and you can just start generating zero knowledge proofs if you want to prove like your age or your uniqueness or whatever it is. And as I mentioned, we have this privacy as network effect model. So the other great thing about using this app is that every time you use it, you provide plausible deniability to the more vulnerable users who might be using it to protest. So, you know, oh, and also we will distribute our tokens from it. So lots of incentives to use it. And yeah, that is pretty much it. But if you're interested in the project and you want to stay in touch, follow Rarimo. This is also my Twitter, and if you have any questions, or if like after this talk there's any ideas you have for something you want to build or whatever, just DM me. This is the best place to reach